It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. This week,
I understand and share the anger up and down the country at seeing Number 10 staff seeming to make light of lockdown measures.
Millions of people now think the Prime Minister was taking them for fools and that they were lied to. They're right, aren't they?
The row continues about parties in Downing Street last year as new COVID restrictions are announced.
We will be introducing mandatory certification based on vaccines or tests in nightclubs and large events.
Why should people at home do things that people working in Number 10 Downing Street are not prepared to do?
And what made the Deputy Speaker say this?
This is anti-democratic practice.
It's budget week here at Holyrood and the Scottish Government has set out its first spending plans since that cooperation agreement between the SNP and the Greens.
Let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, as we saw there in the headlines, the big row in Westminster this week has been again over Christmas parties in Downing Street last year. How did the week unfold?
Well, a difficult week politically for the Prime Minister and possibly a happy week personally because his wife gave birth to their baby girl in the middle of it all. But a difficult week politically. It started a couple of weeks ago with talk about rumours of a party in Downing Street. The Prime Minister said then that no rules had been broken. However, on Tuesday this week, a video emerges of Downing Street aides apparently laughing and doing a bit of, oh, if anyone asked us about a party, what would we say? And people saw that very much as probably confirmation that a party had taken place, while other people were under restrictions last year. That all happened the night before Prime Minister's questions. How's the Prime Minister going to handle this in the Commons? He decided to get on the front foot and before anyone could ask him anything about it, to make a statement to say there was going to be an investigation. He probably knew that it wasn't going to get him out of those questions, but he said this anyway.
May I begin by saying that I understand and share the anger up and down the country at seeing Number 10 staff seeming to make light of lockdown measures. And I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. And, Mr. Speaker, I apologise unreservedly for the offence that it has caused up and down the country, and I apologise for the impression that it gives.
I heard what the Prime Minister said at the beginning of this session, but frankly it raises more questions than answers. Last week, I asked the Prime Minister, was there a Christmas party in Downing Street for dozens of people on December the 18th? The Prime Minister, the government, spent the week telling the British public there was no party. All guidance was followed completely. Millions of people now think the Prime Minister was taking them for fools and that they were lied to. They're right, aren't they?
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman probably missed what I said at the beginning, but I apologise. I apologise for the impression that has been given that staff in Downing Street take this less than seriously. I'm sickened myself and furious about that. But I repeat what I have said to him, that I've been repeatedly assured that the rules were not asked the Cabinet Secretary to investigate exactly what happened, and I repeat that there will be consequences for those involved if those rules were broken, Mr. Speaker.
An internal investigation into what happened. The situation is as clear as day. I thought last week was, Mr. Speaker, I thought last week was bad enough. Surely the Prime Minister isn't now going to start pretending that the first he knew about this was last night. Surely.
It's in his own house.
We've all watched the video of the Prime Minister's staff, including his personal spokesperson. They knew there was a party. They knew it was against the rules. They knew they couldn't admit it, and they thought it was funny. It's obvious what happened. Anton Decker ahead of the Prime Minister on this. The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it?
Because, Mr. Speaker, I've been repeatedly assured that no rules were broken, Mr. Speaker, and they may not. I understand public anxiety about this, and I understand public indignation. But there is a risk of doing a grave injustice to people who are frankly obeying the rules, Mr. Speaker. That is why the Cabinet Secretary will be conducting an investigation, and that's why there will be the requisite disciplinary action if necessary.
Downing Street wilfully broke the rules and mocked the sacrifices we have all made, shattering the public's trust. The Prime Minister is responsible for losing the trust of the people. He can no longer lead on the most pressing issue facing these islands. The Prime Minister has a duty, the only right and moral choice left to him. It is for his resignation. When can we expect it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the party opposite, and indeed the other party opposite, are going to continue to play politics. I am going to get on with the job. I think it is very, very sad that when the public need to hear clarity from their officials and from politicians, the parties opposite are trying to muddy the waters about events or non-events of a year ago, Mr. Speaker, and that is what they are doing today.
There are media reports of a Cabinet meeting and press conference this afternoon to initiate COVID Winter Plan B without reference to this House. COVID passes will not increase uptake of the vaccine, but will create a segregated society. Is my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, aware that very few will be convinced by this diversionary tactic?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no decisions will be taken without consulting the Cabinet.
Well, that was the Conservative MP William Wragg, Susan, wasn't it? Unhappy there about the prospect of new coronavirus restrictions coming into place. And indeed, they were announced later on Wednesday.
That's right. I mean, that was pretty brutal stuff, really, from a Conservative MP. And if there was any idea that this was a thing that could get them into calmer waters, I'm not sure that it will, because a lot of Conservative MPs are really very unhappy about the ideas of more curbs on freedoms in England. I was in the press gallery for Prime Minister's questions looking down, and I have to say that Conservative MPs were really very silent. There weren't lots of cheers backing up the Prime Minister there. So there's a lot of unhappiness around the idea that there are the restrictions at all. And very much they know that their voters don't like the idea that a Downing Street elite, as they see it, is breaking the rules while they have to keep to the restrictions. So when the Health Secretary did come along later on to say that there would be more restrictions in England, he got a pretty rough ride from his own side.
First, guidance on working from home. We will be reintroducing this guidance. It will be updated to say that only people who cannot work from home should continue to go into their workplace. We know that this has an important part to play in slowing transmission, both at workplaces and on public transport. Second, certification. We will be introducing mandatory certification based on vaccines or tests in nightclubs and large events. This will reduce the number of unvaccinated infectious people in venues, which could limit overall transmission. Third, face coverings. We'll be extending the legal requirement for shops and public transport to all indoor public settings, including attractions and recreation, although hospitality will be exempt, and will be exempting specific activities where it is not possible or practical to wear a face covering, for example, singing and exercise.
On this side of the House, we have always put public health before party politics at every point throughout this pandemic. And so I want to be clear with the House and with the country that Labour will support these measures in the national interest. And let me reassure the Secretary of State that he doesn't need to compromise with the interest behind him. He has the votes he needs to do what's right by the public, and that's all the reassurance the country needs.
This is not a choice between more or less restrictions. This is a choice between taking action early to prevent a future lockdown or making such a lockdown inevitable. We all hope the Omicron variant is milder than Delta, but if it isn't, a failure to act now could cost many lives.
It is unquestionably the case that over the last couple of weeks, the government's credibility, whether it's on Patterson or on the Christmas parties, has taken a hit. Why should people at home, listening to the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State, do things that people working in number 10 Downing Street are not prepared to do?
Today he comes with his latest in a long line of arbitrary, unnecessary socialist measures, supported by the socialists on the other side of the House as well. Can he give me any reason at all why I shouldn't tell my constituents to treat these rules in exactly the same way that number 10 Downing Street treated last year's rules?
So, yes, as you say, Sajid Javid feeling the heat there from his own side. And also, it's uncomfortable to have to rely, from the government's perspective, with their big majority, on Labour votes, if they have to get it through. Now, there is going to be a vote, isn't there, on these restrictions next week. But some of it's retrospective, because some of those restrictions will already be in place.
Yes, and that's something that particularly irritates, well, all MPs really, not just on the government's own side. But as you say, those regulations will get through in the vote. I think it's going to be on Tuesday, but with the help of opposition MPs. I understand that quite a lot of Conservatives will rebel. I've seen numbers as many as 60, which is quite a lot.
It is.
And they may feel emboldened to do that, really, because of all the rows about parties and that kind of thing as well. So it rumbles on.
Susan, we'll be back with you in just a few moments' time, but we're going to go to Scotland because, as you heard earlier, it's budget week there. So let's go to our reporter Jenny Davidson in Holyrood, who can tell us all about it.
That's right. As you say, the Scottish budget was the biggest event of this week, and it's the first since the SNP partnership agreement with the Scottish Greens. Now, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes had 3 key priorities: reducing inequality, tackling climate change and supporting economic recovery. And there was something in there for all of those, including doubling the Scottish child payment to £20 a week, which had already been announced, changing the thresholds of the 2 lower rates of income tax, extending business rates relief of 50% for the first 3 months of the next financial year, £2 billion for low carbon infrastructure, and more money for the NHS and a pay rise for social care workers. But the key discussion, as well as spending choices, had been about the amount of the spending pot that was available. The UK government saying there was more money. It was an 8% rise on pre-pandemic levels of funding, the block grant. But Kate Forbes arguing that because COVID funding wasn't being repeated, they were having to absorb COVID costs into the normal budget, meaning there would be some hard choices. The Tories disagreed with this, and they've also been on the lookout for some changes in the budget and whether there was a decrease in support for roads due to this partnership with the Scottish Greens.
But I have to say I'm absolutely astonished that for this budget she's not been able to at least acknowledge that she has at her disposal record block grant funding from Rishi Sunak and the UK government. We wanted the SNP to extend 75% rates relief to customer-facing businesses in the next financial year, a measure which would be worth £631 million to businesses. And so we think businesses will be disappointed by today's budget statement. We will reject any attempt by the SNP, whether now or in later budgets, to backtrack on its £2.2 billion of commitments to upgrade the road network, including the dualling of the A9 and A96, which are not only important for connectivity and economic growth, but provide a much-needed lifeline for our rural communities, many of which have suffered disproportionately during the pandemic.
You can't, by any calculations, come to any other conclusion but that next year's budget is a reduction on this year's budget. Why? Because the Tories have wished COVID away. They have stripped out all COVID consequentials. That's funding to tackle the impact of COVID on our health service, on our justice system, on our transport system. We know, and the people of Scotland know, that COVID continues to have an impact. If you want to deliver the many choices and the many options that you have set out today, you will need to tell the Parliament how you're going to do that. What will you cut, or what taxes will you hike? Because at the end of the day, if we are to deliver the health and social care funding, if we are to protect businesses with the pressures that they face, and most importantly, if we are to absorb all the COVID costs within our budget because there is no additional COVID funding, then there is very stark choices facing this Parliament. And I think every party, including the Tories, need to be clear what they'll cut or what tax rates will rise.
Well, of course, the question in all this that's pushed back to the opposition parties is if they want to make different spending decisions, how would they fund it? And Labour's been mocked this week for leaving the notes for their response lying around the Scottish Parliament, meaning Kate Forbes had the chance to respond to their response.
Over recent weeks, the Cabinet Secretary, and indeed has repeated today, she's attempted to dampen expectations, claiming she has no money. But this is not true. The block grant this year will increase by £3.9 billion, 7.7% in real terms. That is the largest increase in the block grant since 2001. So the Cabinet Secretary has choices to use these funds to be bold, to deliver recovery, or continue SNP-managed decline. And Scottish Labour make no apologies for pushing her to be bold, to make recovery real, not just a political posture or a name check.
You know, it's really unfortunate to hear the Labour Party parroting the Conservatives' press release in terms of the funding available. The Conservatives will parrot that line. Labour should get behind the headlines and recognise the fact that we have got to absorb all the COVID costs within our budget. But one of the advantages in seeing what Labour's asks were ahead of time was that I did some calculations, and their overall asks, we calculate, comes to approximately £3 billion of additional funding. You know, assuming that the Labour Party don't want us to cut anything within the budget that's been published, can I check if they want every taxpayer in Scotland to be paying £1,000 more per year in order to deliver that?
Well, the Scottish budget debate was fairly good-natured, but it was a different story at First Minister's questions this week, which was fairly tetchy. The presiding officer had to stop proceedings on a number of occasions to ask MSPs to stop jeering and heckling across the benches. This was particularly the case during questions from Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross. He was attempting to question Nicola Sturgeon about support from oil and gas, following comments from Scottish Green co-leader Patrick Harvey, who's now a Scottish Government Minister, saying that only hard-right people support oil and gas nowadays. But he, in turn, was facing questions over the Christmas parties at Westminster, despite the fact that he has said that Boris Johnson should resign as Prime Minister if he's found to have misled Parliament. Now, Nicola Sturgeon went even further than her previous position and made it clear that she thought Boris Johnson should now resign.
Boris Johnson has jeopardised public compliance with COVID measures.
Ms Mackay, sorry. First of all, I don't want to have to ask again in this session for quiet so that we can hear members. But Ms Mackay, can you please ask a question? Thank you.
Boris Johnson has jeopardised public compliance with COVID measures. Does the First Minister agree with me that it is time for this corrupt Prime Minister to go?
First Minister. What are you doing?
Yes, I do, Presiding Officer. While Gillian Mackay was asking her question there, I had members of the Tory group shouting at me from a sedentary position that these issues had nothing to do with us here in the Scottish Parliament. Well, I beg to differ. I think the principles and the values of openness, integrity and transparency matter to all of us who care about democracy in this country. I don't think it is simply a corrupt incumbent of number 10 that has to go. I think it's time for Scotland to get rid of the whole broken, corrupt Westminster system that is holding us back. And we can only do that, Presiding Officer, by becoming an independent country.
Well, this issue about Christmas parties at Westminster last year has proved to be more far-reaching than expected. Originally, it just looked like a small story that might be in the political bubble, but actually people in Scotland are angry about it too. And it's been a difficult week for the Conservatives at Westminster answering questions about this, but it's also been a difficult week for the Conservatives at Holyrood, despite Douglas Ross's attempts to distance himself from that. And it's a story that doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. It's going to continue.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny Davidson reporting there at the Scottish Parliament. Susan, tell us a little bit more about what's been happening in Westminster other than parties in Downing Street last year.
Well, there was a rather uncomfortable afternoon for the head of the Foreign Office, Sir Philip Barton, about Afghanistan and the pullout from there in August. Now, take you back to August, you'll remember when the Taliban was sweeping across Afghanistan to the gates of Kabul, and the British and US and other countries who'd been there for a long time scrambled to get out. There was this extraordinary airlift trying to get out their own people and Afghans who'd helped them over the years. The Foreign Affairs Committee is looking into all that, and they've had a written submission from a whistleblower who worked at the Foreign Office, Raphael Marshall, and he's painted a pretty devastating picture of the way the operation was run in the Foreign Office. So he was saying that on some occasions he was the only person trying to work his way through these thousands of emails from desperate Afghans saying that they had a right to be airlifted out, that people were working from home, that they were working quite short hours, and also that a lot of people were on holiday, a lot of senior people. The Foreign Secretary was on holiday. The head of the Foreign Office, Sir Philip Barton, was on holiday and didn't come back in a hurry. Now, when Sir Philip Barton appeared before MPs on the Foreign Affairs Committee, he knew he was going to be asked about his holiday, so he did have his answers already.
What day did you return from holidays, Philip?
So I'm happy to go into dates in a minute, Chair, but let me just say before I do that, I mean, I have reflected a lot since August on my leave, and if I had my time again, I would have come back from my leave earlier than I did.
This was a catastrophe. This was not all the other things going on that we'd like to say, oh, well, there are lots of other things going on. This was a catastrophe of incomparable nature. That Mr Marshall set out in his evidence issues around no staff being conscripted properly into the crisis centre, no linguists, no computers, no access proper for visitors, no night shift system.
It was an extremely complex and difficult crisis. We did, enabled by the military on the ground very bravely, making sure that it was secure enough in Kabul, led in difficult circumstances by Solori. Managed to evacuate 15,000 people. I do acknowledge there were things that we could have done better, and we all wish we could have got more people out, and there are, I'm sure, lessons we can learn.
These things are very rare, and actually there comes a point where people really have to put their shoulder to the grindstone, and if you've got soldiers at Kabul airport working around the clock, I mean, people clocking off after 8 hours, not bothering to come in for a weekend. It's all sort of complacent and woolly and waffly and unfocused and sort of just a bit rubbish, isn't it?
I simply don't recognise that. I think it's based on on a misunderstanding. There isn't a clocking off culture at all in the FCDO. We spend more time actually trying to persuade not to work too hard and to burn out.
Can you just tell us when you went on holiday?
Yeah, I went on holiday on the 9th of August.
The 9th.
Just to repeat what I said.
Yeah, no, I've got it. I've got it. You don't need to repeat it.
I'm going to say it again. You know, I have reflected on this very carefully, and if I had my time again,
yeah.
I would have come back.
It sounds less credible every time you repeat it, Sir Philip. It sounds platitudinous.
Yes, deeply uncomfortable there on the Foreign Affairs Committee. At the start of this week, we also got details of a 10-year drug strategy from the government. Susan, what does it involve?
Yeah. On Monday, on the government's grid, on its diary, they'd been hoping that this was going to be Crime Policy Week and they could talk about that all week before they got buffeted off course, really, by a sort of political storm Arwen about those parties and other things. We saw Boris Johnson start the week. He'd gone to Liverpool, up very early on Monday morning. He's had his police beanie hat and stab vest on to go out with a drugs gang raid to illustrate it. And back in the Commons, the Minister presented it all, as you say, a 10-year policy to cut down on things like county lines, in which youngsters are sent out trying to peddle drugs out in towns and villages, and to trying to put a stop to that.
Our new strategy, From Harm to Hope, is a blueprint for driving drugs out of our cities, towns and villages and making sure those affected get the help they so badly need. We need to be clear that those who break the law should face consequences for their actions. That's why our commitment includes going even further in this mission, with a white paper next year to ensure that the penalties for this recreational use are tougher and have a clear and increasing impact. These penalties must be meaningful for the individual, which is why we're considering options such as increased powers to fine individuals, requirements to attend drug awareness courses and other reporting requirements and restrictions on their movement, including possibly the confiscation of passports and driving licence.
In his statement, the Minister talks of ambitious plans, but what's missing is any recognition that the policies followed by this Conservative government over the last 11 years have caused such damage. The truth is, this is a government that has dropped the ball on drugs and dropped the ball on crime.
I particularly welcome the emphasis on hopefully holding professional classes to account for their actions. You know, they may want to buy their fair trade coffee and go to the farmer's market and buy their organic food, but maybe they should spend more time thinking about the cocaine they buy for their weekend parties. Because that fuels county lines, and the county lines is possibly the worst grooming, safeguarding concerns in this country for our young people.
In 2016, in response to an HIV outbreak, Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board proposed a supervised drug consumption room, an overdose prevention room. The Home Office has sat on that request, has blocked that request for 5 years, with absolutely no justification, while people in Glasgow, in my constituency, have died. So can I ask the Minister, when he next comes to Glasgow, will he show the bravery that the Scottish Government's Drug Minister has shown and come for a walk with me and tell me why people injecting in their groin in the snow tomorrow can support his drugs policy?
The Honourable Lady often vents her fury, I guess, and anger and anguish about the situation in Glasgow, which is appalling, on me. She rarely does it on our Scottish Government colleagues, who of course have presided over the incidence of drug deaths in her city for many years now. She can shout at me all she likes, but until she's shouting at me and the Scottish Government, it's hard to take her completely seriously.
Passions running high there in that Commons debate on the government's drug strategy. Susan, thank you for the moment. We're going to go to Cardiff now and find out what's happening in the Welsh Parliament. Our reporter Cemlyn Davis is there. Hello to you, Cemlyn. There was a welcome return to frontline politics this week for the leader of the Conservatives. What happened?
Yes, that's right. Andrew Davis had been away from work since September after initially contracting COVID. He then took further time off to deal with mental health issues. There was a warm welcome, as you say, when he returned to the Senedd this week, and he acknowledged that welcome when he made his first contribution during Tuesday's session of First Minister's Questions.
I could pass on my thanks to all members from across this chamber and beyond who sent best wishes to me, in particular the personal note that the First Minister wrote to me. It was greatly appreciated, along with other ministers as well then. We can leave no quarter yield in this chamber, but when we get outside this chamber, we are all human beings, and that support was greatly appreciated, to say the least. I went out to this chamber in September, 19.5 stone. I am now 17.5 stone. So there's 2 stone less of Welsh beef in this chamber today.
We've disagreed many times in this chamber, Andrew, and I'm sure we'll disagree many times again, and sometimes passionately, but can I say we've always had the best of personal relationships, and can I also pay tribute to the way in which you spoke openly about issues of well-being, and you were a real inspiration for us all in that.
Oh, well, very warm response there for his return, Kemlyn. But then Andrew R.T. Davies was keen to question the First Minister about the vaccine booster programme in Wales. What did he say?
Yes, that's right, because earlier on Tuesday, the Health Minister had confirmed that the Welsh Government aims to offer all eligible adults a booster vaccine by the end of January. Eluned Morgan acknowledged that that will be a huge effort for the NHS. And so Andrew R.T. Davies wanted to know what impact that would have on frontline services in Wales.
I'd like to ask you, First Minister, around primary health care, and in particular last week's comments from the BMA, which said that something had to give with the booster rollout in other services, and the Health Minister agreed with the provision that most probably there would have to be a curtailment in those provisions in doctors' surgeries in particular. Other governments in the UK have made an announcement over the weekend. Are you in a position to announce what services might be temporarily withdrawn from community services, especially primary medical services, because obviously that ultimately could lead to greater demand on A&E units across Wales?
The things that will have to be put to one side temporarily, we hope will be the most routine aspects of primary care. Important things, I know. We pay a lot of money through the contract to our GMS colleagues to carry out those surveillance activities, monitoring of people's diabetic condition, their blood pressure, all of those things. It's not for a moment to say they're not important, but of all the things that GPs do, they probably can be set to one side for a brief period of time in order to have greater capacity in primary care to deliver more of the vaccination programme because of the urgent need to get ahead as far as we can and as fast as we can of the likely impact of that new variant.
Well, the urgency of the situation became clearer later on Tuesday when the First Minister gave a further statement, including this stark warning.
We now stand on the brink of another potentially perilous moment in our efforts to keep Wales safe and to keep Wales open. Our public health experts have modelled the potential effect of the new variant in Wales, drawing on the latest information from South Africa and other parts of the world. While there is still a great deal to be learned, and any modelling at this point is inevitably provisional, we have to brace ourselves for the potential for a formidable wave of new infections in the new year, potentially just 6 weeks from now, if we cannot slow the spread of this new variant.
Well, the call from the First Minister, of course, was that everyone who's offered a jab takes up that offer. Getting vaccinated is the best gift anyone can give themselves or their families this Christmas, the First Minister said.
Yeah, members have been expressing concerns about some people not wearing masks on public transport. How did that come about?
Yes, that's right. And remember, wearing face covering on public transport has remained a legal requirement all along since restrictions were broadly lifted over the summer. But there are concerns recently that many people simply aren't following the rules. And one Plaid Cymru MS had asked commuters to share their experiences with her on social media. And she listed some of the comments she'd received here on Wednesday.
Crammed carriages, nobody wearing masks, people crammed like sardines, impossible to ensure COVID safety, like a cattle cart and little mask wearing, 90% not wearing masks on the Rumney line, windows shut with no ventilation. One person said they thought they caught COVID on an overcrowded TFW train between Chester and Bangor a few weeks ago. Another said she had a panic attack on the train during the last rugby game day because so many people were stood and crammed on the train.
The issue of mask wearing is ultimately one about personal responsibility. There are people claiming to be exempt from mask wearing when clearly that is not the case, but it is almost impossible to prove that. We have, working with British Transport Police, measures in place to enforce mask wearing, and a number of people have been removed from services when challenged and not able to provide a valid excuse. But I think there are a confluence of conditions all converging to make things very challenging.
Lee Waters there, and he said that the recent stormy weather, the recent rugby internationals here in Cardiff, and staff absences down to self-isolation, for example, have all added pressure onto the system, and particularly the rail network. But he did also insist that public transport remains safe.
Thank you very much, Cemlyn. Let's head to Belfast now and talk to Jim Fitzpatrick, who can tell us what's been happening in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Jim, there's been a big row this week about a bill trying to ban hunting with dogs in Northern Ireland. What's the background to this?
Joe, well, hunting wild animals with dogs has been illegal across the UK since the early 2000s, but not here in Northern Ireland. We've been an outlier, and this has been a private member's bill taken by Alliance member John Blair that would essentially bring things into line with the rest of the UK. It enjoyed quite a lot of cross-party support, and some interested members put forward their own personal views on the subject. But there was one party that whipped its members to vote against this bill and thus ensure its defeat. So who was the party that appears to align itself with those people in red coats on horses chasing foxes with hounds? Well, some people were surprised to learn, and indeed many of their supporters seemed to be surprised to find out that it was the Irish Republican Party, Sinn Féin. So here is Declan McAleer, the party's Agriculture and Rural Affairs spokesman, explaining the reasons why they oppose this bill.
Sinn Féin do not agree with a ban on hunting. However, there are elements of this bill that we do agree with. The legislation as it currently stands, we feel, is unworkable and would require significant additional time in the committee to rectify it, and that's time that we don't currently have, given the challenges of other legislation such as both the climate change bills. I have no doubt that this issue will be revisited in the next mandate when the appropriate time can be set aside to examine the issue in the round and to work alongside stakeholders to see what legislative changes are needed, if any.
So Declan McAleer, they're essentially saying that they thought there wasn't enough time to get this bill up to the standard that they would like. Now, not many people completely buy that, and even he himself said there was a strong lobby in some rural areas against this ban. And it's not so much that Sinn Féin are supporting those who are chasing foxes with hounds. There's another sport here that is popular in some rural areas called hare coursing, which is a blood sport where dogs essentially catch and kill hares. That enjoys support in some areas where Sinn Féin enjoys support, so that may have been a factor. The DUP didn't whip their members to vote against this bill, although most did, but interestingly some voted to support it, and that caused some interesting internecine rows and spats between DUP members. Here's one. Christopher Stalford, a South Belfast MLA, who got annoyed when he was constantly interrupted by a fellow member.
So the idea that there's some silent majority out there that is in favour of the maintenance of hunting with hounds, that's just nonsense. It's not borne out by any measure at all of public opinion. The majority of citizens want hunting abolished in this country. Happy to.
Thank the member for giving way, and I know he has a particular opinion on this bill. So I could ask the member, he will realise that one of the most controversial aspects is Clause 2, which is the ban of trail hunting. Could I ask the member, does he know the difference between trail hunting and drag hunting? One to be made illegal in this bill and the other to be kept legal. And if he does, could he explain to the House how indeed the police could differentiate?
Well, if the member wishes to include it in the bill, I'm happy to vote for that too. If the member wishes to have it included in the bill, I'm happy to vote for that too. I think the recent decision taken by the National Trust in relation to trail and drag hunting, demonstrated, and the recent High Court judgment on this matter demonstrated, that trail hunting is used as a cover for the hunting of wild mammals. And every member would cease chuntering from a sedentary position. You'll have your turn.
So good use of the verb to chunter there by Christopher Stolford. The bill was ultimately defeated, 45 votes to 38.
Yes, sounds like it was quite heated there, Jim. Members were also looking at welfare support for people at the end of their lives. What happened in that debate?
Well, this was a moment of consensus across the parties and in the chamber. Essentially what the MLAs did was they changed the regulations for social security payments for those people who are terminally ill and brought forward the time limit where payments are currently restricted to those who have 6 months to live and changed it to 12 months to give people more time. And essentially that was because they've been hearing many heartfelt stories of delays and bureaucracy that have caused real concern and problems, like this one, which was discussed by Mark Durkin of the SDLP.
The delay in accessing payments has a unique impact on individuals with a terminal illness, given the time is a luxury that they haven't been afforded. In the words of one case study from research provided by Marie Curie, "My brother died waiting. We received a letter saying he was fit for work on the day of his funeral." How can anyone reasonably conclude that we have a system with people's best interests at heart when what we have lacks any heart at all?
So perhaps with stories like that, it's no surprise that these changes were passed.
Jim, thank you very much there from Belfast. Let's return to Westminster and to Susan and look at one more story, because we heard in the headlines and we saw the Deputy Speaker Eleanor Lang. She was clearly cross about something. It was to do with the government's Nationality and Borders Bill. What happened?
Yeah, there's some quite bizarre scenes, actually. This is the government's flagship immigration bill, and it seeks to try and stop those dangerous crossings over the Channel by migrants, and it makes a lot of changes to the way people can seek asylum in the UK. It is very controversial. A lot of opposition and some Conservative MPs say that it will deny people seeking asylum their human rights. So when it came to some voting late on, some MPs, I think really as a protest, tried to hold up the vote, apparently by locking themselves in the loos, in the voting lobbies. Just to remind viewers that MPs vote by walking through physically voting lobbies to vote. So this normally takes about 15 minutes, but it was taking a lot longer, and the Deputy Speaker got pretty cross about it.
It is simply wrong if people are taking too long to vote, deliberately obstructing the tellers from coming through, remaining in the lobby when there's no need for them to be remaining in the lobby, in order to stop other business taking place in this House this afternoon. That is unacceptable. Would the Sergeant-at-Arms please investigate once again the delay? This is anti-democratic practice.
Oh, quite a rebuke there from the Deputy Speaker. What happened with the vote then in the end?
Well, the votes went through, the government won, but what did happen was that it left only 9 minutes for the final stage of that bill, where the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was meant to be summing it all up. 9 minutes, not very long. So perhaps they got their way, but as you could see, the Deputy Speaker was furious.
Yeah, no, she really was angry. And it's not the end, of course, for this key government bill. It's now going to go through the House of Lords. What are we expecting there?
Well, once controversial bills get to the House of Lords, it's not so easy for the government there. It's not so easy for them to win votes. They don't have the majority there that they have in the Commons. So it's likely that the Lords, they like to go through things very, very carefully, look at the detail, make changes. Sometimes the government kind of comes round to that way of thinking. So I think we will see probably some government defeats there and attempts to change it.
Thank you very much to you, Susan Hume, and the end of a very busy week. I'll be back, though, on Monday at 12:15 with another edition of Politics Live. Until then, have a very good weekend. Bye-bye.